Hello, Dr. Vamsi Perjuri and fellow computer scientists. I hope you're having an amazing day or evening. My name is Julius, and today I'm going to go over the Ruby programming languages with Pranav. So the goal of this presentation is to help a developer decide if Ruby is a good language for them to work with, and introduce a new programmer to the Ruby programming language, give a detailed analysis on the programming language, and go over its popularity over the years. So in this presentation, we're going to go over a couple of things. We're going to go over the history of Ruby in terms of the developer, the year of development, and also the goals of the developer and the language. We will also explore the basic features, including paradigms and some special data types. Next, we're gonna go over some comparisons between C++ and Ruby. We believe most of us are very familiar with C++. C++ is also among the most popular or the most used programming languages today. And we thought it'd be a great language to be compared to. Next, we will examine some pros and cons of Ruby and what it has to offer to the computer and the developer. Most languages must make a compromise, and Ruby is one of them. Some of these cons can be negative, can affect the programmer and the programmer's workflow negatively. And to make Ruby more suitable, next, we're gonna go over some tools. There are many tools that can make your Ruby experience even better, and some of these tools are going to be introduced later on in the presentation. Next, we're going to discuss some of the uses of Ruby, as well as some widely known applications and websites that Ruby was used to make. Some of these I think will shock you and you'll find very interesting. And after these uses are covered, we're going to go over the medium program implementation and what we decided to go with. And then after that, we're going to give you a little bit of a tutorial. And after this tutorial, we're going to give you a reflection and a conclusion, kind of what we think, kind of a summary of everything. So first of all, we're going to discuss the Ruby. And we're going to give you a brief history of it. So Ruby was developed by Mr. Matsumoto in 1995 in Japan. He was inspired by many of his favorite programming languages and incorporated some of his favorite elements from each of them into Ruby. According to the creator, Ruby was influenced by Perl, Smalltalk, Eiffel, ADA or ADA, BASIC, and Lisp. He set out to make a programming language that is easy to read and write. His goal was to make a programming language that put the programmer first and the computer and kind of what the computer does second. Leave all the suffering to the computer, right? And saving time with coding, which is not going to be too efficient at runtime. Many frameworks have been made using Ruby, but Ruby gained a lot of popularity when Rails was released. Commonly known as Ruby on Rails. When Rails was released in 2004, it became the #1 rated programming language according to TOB. Rails was made by David Hansen in 2004. And it took about 2 years, before the language really got to its height with the help of Rails. And so the reason why we went with TOB, is because it has a very good track record and is very respected. The TOB Programming Community Index is an indicator of the popularity of programming languages. The index is updated once every month. and ratings are based on a number of skilled engineers worldwide and other third-party vendors. So next, we're gonna go over or look at a screenshot that I got from the website. And yeah, so this popularity in 2006 was largely due to the Rails published in 2004. And the award is given to the programming language that has the highest rise in rating in 1 year. So here's another screenshot from the TIOP website or index. After Rails was released, it took a bit over a year to really get adopted into many workflows. But unfortunately, the rating dropped after its peak in 2009. But Ruby still remains among the top 15 popular languages, according to TIOP today. Well, that's pretty good. Next, we're going to look at some basic features and paradigms. So firstly, Ruby is a high-level language, very easy to be written and read. Also, Ruby is a backend language. What a backend language is that it does kind of the behind the scenes things that a user is not gonna get direct access to, or the user is not gonna interact with. It's also objects oriented, because I uses more of objects to run its code than just simple functions. Ruby is also dynamically typed. This simply means that it performs type checking during runtime and not during compile time. Initially, Ruby was interpreted. The question as to whether Ruby is hybrid, interpreted, compiled is very tricky, because Ruby can be interpreted and it can be compiled, but Ruby is not usually a hybrid language. So initially Ruby was only interpreted, but now it can either be interpreted or compiled. The original interpreter made for Ruby is called Matt's Ruby interpreter, made by the Ruby curator. Now, a lot of different ways to run it to make it compiled. Can use Rubinius just-in-time compiler, or JRuby just-in-time, using the Java virtual machine. Then next, we're going to go over some of the differences between C++ and Ruby. So Ruby is a strongly typed programming language is one that enforces strict restrictions on intermixing of values and different data types. When such restrictions are violated, it usually occurs, or an error usually occurs. Ruby is also dynamically typed, as previously discussed on the previous slide, whilst C++ is static, which means it does type checking at compile time and not at runtime like Ruby does. C++ is not geared towards object-oriented programming, but can still be used for it not as efficiently as Ruby though, because Ruby is made for object-oriented programming. But C++ is faster in terms of performance, since it's more catering to the computer than the programmer. This is because Ruby is more flexible, writable, and readable, so it advantages the programmer. So next, Pranav is going to go over some pros and cons and some other aspects of Ruby on Rails. Thank you very much.
Now let's look at the pros and cons of Ruby. First and foremost is clean syntax. Ruby is a very clean syntax that makes code both easier to read and easier to write, far more than traditional object-oriented languages, such as Java, for example. For beginning programmers, this means the focus was on the meaning of the program, where it should be, rather than trying to figure out the meaning of random characters. Ruby has a large ecosystem of tools and libraries for just about every use, such as web application frameworks like Rails, Sinatra, and Pole, virtualization orchestration like Docker API, and GUI frameworks like Shoes and FXV. And the list goes on. If you can think of it, there's probably a gem for that. And if not, you can create your own and share with the community. It also has an open source, well-developed community. This community is a centerpiece around Ruby's success and popularity. Not only does it lend a helping hand to new developers, it also moves Ruby through the various tools and libraries that are still being implemented to this day. Another good thing about Ruby is it's multi-platformed. So where you can reach it on Linux, Windows, Mac, iOS, and Android. And all these together make it such an easy language to start with. Now let's look at the cons. So the flexibility in Ruby does have its drawbacks. Despite the high speed of its development, Ruby doesn't always demonstrate the highest performance. On one hand, Ruby runs mostly for the user's convenience. But on the other hand, the volume for such operations affects its performance. This isn't the worst, but it could be better. Ruby doesn't teach you about data types. Since this is a dynamically typed language, similar to Python, you'll never have to worry about them. This sounds great though. Data types are one of the most important concepts of programming in the programming languages. This will also cause trouble in the long because you have to face a static language. At that point, you wouldn't need to learn data types from scratch. It has also been declining in popularity, partly due to Node.js and Python. Ruby's popularity was mostly driven by its framework, Rails, or Ruby on Rails. So when the Rails hype had started to decline, so had Ruby's. So let's look at Ruby tools. The Ruby on Rails framework is founded on two main principles, DRY and COC. DRY, an acronym short for Don't Repeat Yourself, declares that everything within the system must be entirely independent for its corresponding role. This allows users using Rails not need to rewrite the same information over and over again. This small idea allows the system to be less fault-prone, more scalable, and easier to maintain. The other principle is COC, or convention over configuration, which uses Ruby's best way of building web apps over other systems. Since developers don't have to spend too much time on configuration, the applications can be produced on such a faster scale. Developers using Ruby could use many of the programs readily available, just an install and click away. These programs can make creating a project so much easier, from the designing phase all the way to the deployment phase. Sidekick is one of those programs. It is designed to be able to handle any kind of job scheduling in Ruby. It mainly uses the first in, first out method to manage all jobs, which makes it perfectly geared for all purposes. A real-life application of this program would be to if you were to send out a mass notification to all clients. Instead of sending it to them one by one, you would implement Sidekick, which would send it to them using first in, first out method. So what if you wanted to keep track of all of the updates and our notifications being sent out to clients? It could be a gruesome task to have to write down every single update between an employer, the client. In a production environment, the tasks and difficulties slow down development at larger scale. Loggly is a perfect solution for this so-called predicament. Loggly, like the company SolarWinds, is a cloud-based solution for Ruby logging. This platform lets you maintain all your logs on a central basis, which means you can use this dashboard to manage not only Ruby's logs, but also logs from other applications. An added benefit to Loggly is that previous logs are automatically archived and you can keep them for as long as you'd like. The company of Loggly, which is SolarWinds, also creates another application called AppOptics, which is a performance monitoring application. With Ruby monitoring and tracing, you can see real-time performance stats, both across distributed apps and as single service tiers. Real-time in that it shows us any ups and downs in the performance instantly. This makes developers and testers quicker at the corrections of faults in the performance aspect. Now think about the last time you used a printed map to find quick directions to any location you choose. Troublesome, right? In our era of technology, it's so much easier just to pull out Google Maps to look up directions to the nearest limbs than it is to look up street names on a printed map of Arkansas. Location detecting and tracking have become an important aspect of many applications. Geocoder, for example, a location tool is used for work related to location tracking, and is completely free since it is open source software. This tool is very comprehensive when it comes to many features, like geocoding for IP addresses, caching, and has the ability to connect with over 40 APIs on a global scale. Now let's look at Ruby's uses and applications. One aspect would be Ruby's web development, which is one of Ruby's rise to fame because of its corresponding framework, Ruby on Rails. Ruby is a great choice to create web apps because it's extremely fast and offers features that were tried and tested by its community. Ruby has a lot of gems, which are perfect for e-commerce. So if you wanted an online shop running in the least amount of time, Ruby has it all. Ruby is also the main infrastructure for e-commerce company, Shopify. Ruby is also great for prototyping. Big in prototyping because it's perfect to create test versions for all your application needs. The some applications in the world that use Ruby would be Airbnb, GitHub, Goodreads, Hulu, and MyFitnessPal. Now let's take a look at how Ruby works.
So we will be looking at implementation of 3 ways to implement Hello World in Ruby. I will be using jdoodle.com. They have an online Ruby IDE, which I will be using to compile our Ruby code. But first, I'll be looking at implementing Hello World, both Hello World and Bubble Sort, which will be our medium program. So for Hello World, the first way to output Hello World to the console will be through puts. So puts Hello World. to execute this, as you see here, it outputs hello world. So that's one of our 3 options for outputting hello world to console. Our second option, set up puts, would be to print. And similar to puts, the output would be very similar also. So print would be similar to puts, and it also outputs hello world. Our third option, which is slightly different, let's see if you can actually like spot the difference. So we do P, so P hello world. And if you execute this, you do get hello world, but something seems to be off. P actually executes the entire string that you give it. So P actually outputs hello world in quotation. So our 3 options for outputting hello world to something are puts, print, and P. So now I'll be looking at implementing double sorts into the compiler. So let's look at the program. So first, our method takes a compiler. Our method takes an array as a parameter. So the first lines of our code, they return the original array. It has 0 or 1 element, since it will be sorted. Next, we need to create a loop that will iterate through the array and compare each element with the next one. So what's happening here? So basically, we're using Ruby's generic for loop, which is essentially the same thing as a do while loop. You could also use a while loop, but you need to set your loop check variable outside of the loop. You set it to true instead of false, as you can see here. So once you are inside the loop, we set swap to false, and then we let the program know when to exit the loop. So from there, we start iterating through the elements in our array. So if you're unsure what the array is, if you go down here, our unsorted array is 11, 5, 7, 6, and 15. So this is the array that we will be working with. So the array underscore length -1 variable is going to equal 4. That is because since our array is 5, 5 minus 4 equals 1. 5 minus 1 equals 4, which will be our array. So inside our nested iteration, we compare the elements. For example, since the first iteration of the loop would compare the elements of the array at 0 and the array at 1. This is the bubble sort, so if the array of 1 is greater than the number at array 0, we swap the values. So our nested iterator will continue to loop array length -1 times. So when we really want to exit the loop, remember we have the outer loop in which we are setting swap equals to false. So we want to exit this loop when the inside iterator can move the all adjacent elements, not have to swap. In this case, swap equals false. So it breaks if it doesn't swap, which means that we've successfully sorted the elements in the array. And then finally, we return our sorted array. So if we were to run this, we get the sorted array of 5, 6, 7, 11, and 5. So to top it all off, Matsumoto created a wonderful high-level object-oriented programming language that is dynamically typed. A major difference between Ruby and C++ is that Ruby is far more flexible, writable, and readable compared to other languages, including C++ as well. Ruby is supported by multiple tools, libraries, and a well-developed community, which makes sure that its programs stay up to date and well-tested. One of the frameworks, being Ruby on Rails, which was developed by Heimer, had a major impact on its popularity. Along being integrated into modern society through big names like Airbnb and GitHub. Thank you. Have one.